The first time the HOA representative came to my door, I thought it was just another neighborly visit. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the sunlight painted long golden lines across the lawn, and I was sitting on my porch reading a case file for work. The man who approached me was sharply dressed, clipboard in hand, wearing a smile that felt more rehearsed than genuine. "Good afternoon," he said, introducing himself as the president of the Homeowners Association. "We noticed your property isn't registered under our community membership. I'm sure it's just an oversight." I looked up from my papers, mildly amused. "I wasn't aware this area was under an HOA," I said. He laughed softly, the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to sound friendly but are masking irritation. "Well, technically it's voluntary, but all residents here participate. It helps maintain standards." I nodded, uninterested, and went back to reading. That's when his smile faltered. "Of course," he added, "membership includes mandatory upkeep fees, inspection access, and adherence to our community guidelines. I can have the paperwork ready for you today." I told him politely that I wasn't interested. The way his eyes narrowed told me I had just made a mistake. Over the next few days, little things started happening. A note was left on my mailbox warning me that my lawn was non-compliant. Someone threw garbage bags onto my driveway at night. Then came the citation letter on official HOA letterhead stating that my property was in violation of community aesthetic standards and that I was subject to fines. I ignored it, assuming it was an intimidation tactic. My house sat on the edge of the neighborhood, technically outside their jurisdiction. But that didn't stop them. Every day, a new letter. Every day, another petty act of harassment. It was almost laughable, except that it wasn't. I'd spent my career as a federal judge, dealing with people who abused power, who thought they could twist laws for their own benefit. I recognized the same arrogance in these so-called neighbors. One evening, I was returning home late from court when I saw flashlights flickering in my backyard. I stepped quietly through the side gate and found two men spraying paint across my fence. They jumped when I shouted, dropping the cans and running off into the darkness. The next morning, my fence was tagged with the words "Join or Leave." I contacted the local police, filed a report, and showed them the surveillance footage from my security cameras. They promised to investigate, but the officer's tone told me not to expect much. "We've had issues with this HOA before," he admitted. "They're persistent." I didn't realize then how far that persistence would go. Weeks passed, and the harassment escalated. I'd wake up to find nails scattered across my driveway. Someone dumped motor oil on my front steps. Anonymous calls came late at night, always silent, always ending with a click. I replaced my locks, installed motion lights, and tried to go about my life as usual, but the sense of unease grew heavier with every passing day. I'd spent years handling high-profile criminal cases, some involving dangerous people, yet nothing unsettled me quite like this: a pack of ordinary citizens, emboldened by the illusion of authority. I knew they were watching me. I could feel it. Then, one night, everything changed. It was close to midnight when I woke up to the faint smell of smoke. At first, I thought it was from a neighbor's chimney, but the scent grew stronger, acrid, burning. I got out of bed and saw the orange glow dancing through my window. My heart dropped. The side of my house was on fire. I ran for the phone, called emergency services, and then grabbed the fire extinguisher, but by the time I reached the back door, the flames were already consuming the siding. The heat was intense, the air thick with choking black smoke. I barely made it outside before part of the roof gave way with a deafening crack. Neighbors started to emerge, some filming on their phones instead of helping. I stood there, barefoot on the wet grass, watching as the fire devoured everything I'd built. Within minutes, the house was engulfed. The fire department arrived quickly, but it was too late. Hours later, when the flames were finally extinguished, only the charred remains of my home stood against the pale light of dawn. The fire marshal approached me, his face grim. "Looks like accelerant was used," he said quietly. "This wasn't an accident." I didn't need to ask who was responsible. I already knew. The HOA president showed up later that morning, flanked by 2 board members, pretending to be concerned. "Such a tragedy," he said, shaking his head. "You really should have joined when you had the chance. We could have protected you." His words were deliberate, taunting, and something in me snapped. I didn't respond. I just stared at him until he grew uncomfortable and walked away. In the days that followed, investigators combed through the debris, confirming what I already suspected: arson. I provided them with security footage that showed figures lurking near my property earlier that night. Their faces were obscured, but their cars weren't. The license plates traced back to addresses of HOA board members. Still, no arrests were made immediately. The local authorities were hesitant, citing insufficient evidence and ongoing investigation. They didn't know who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. As I stood among the ashes of my home, I felt no despair, only focus. They had taken everything from me, thinking I was just another stubborn homeowner refusing to bow to their petty rules. They had no idea that the man they tried to intimidate was the same federal judge who had overseen some of the toughest corruption cases in the state. I had spent my entire career dismantling systems of abuse, exposing the powerful who thought they were untouchable. And now the HOA had made it personal. I watched as investigators loaded samples of the burnt debris into evidence bags, the smell of smoke still thick in the air. One of them asked if I had anywhere to stay. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. I wasn't thinking about where I would sleep. I was thinking about the court documents I'd soon be filing, the subpoenas I'd issue, and the hearings I would preside over. The HOA had set fire to my home, but they had also ignited something far greater: a reckoning. That night, as I stood in the remains of what used to be my living room, the cold wind cutting through the silence, I made a silent promise. They wanted control. They wanted submission. What they were about to get was justice. Real, unflinching, and merciless. They thought they had burned me down. They didn't realize they had only cleared the ground for me to rebuild stronger, sharper, and ready to bring the entire corrupt system crashing down on their heads. The morning after the fire, I stood beside the blackened remains of my home as the first light of dawn crept across the ashes. The air was heavy with the stench of burned wood and melted metal. Every familiar shape had been twisted by the flames into something unrecognizable. The place where I once sat to drink coffee, where I had shelves lined with law books and photographs of my late wife, was now a hollow skeleton. For a long time, I said nothing. The firefighters were packing up their equipment, the investigators taking their final photos, but I could barely hear them. All I could think about was how deliberate it had all felt: the timing, the smugness of the HOA president the day before, the notes and threats that led up to this moment. It wasn't random. It was retaliation. I drove to the local precinct later that morning to speak with the lead investigator. He was a young man, polite but visibly uncomfortable. When I asked about the status of the investigation, he cleared his throat and said, "We're still gathering evidence, sir. It looks like arson, but until we identify suspects conclusively, we can't proceed with charges. His tone made it sound as though he already knew who did it, but didn't he have the courage to say it aloud? I leaned forward and looked him dead in the eye. "You don't need to tell me who it was," I said. "You just need to do your job and file the report properly. I'll take it from there." The officer nodded nervously, unsure what I meant. Didn't he explain? For the next few days, I stayed in a small hotel near the courthouse, living out of a single suitcase and working quietly behind the scenes. I requested copies of the fire investigation, obtained a list of HOA board members, and began compiling everything I had: the threatening letters, the footage of the trespassers, the note spray painted on my fence. My background as a federal judge gave me access to networks most people didn't even know existed. I contacted a trusted friend in the Department of Justice, someone who had worked with me on several corruption cases. I told him everything that had happened, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. "You're telling me the HOA burned your house down?" he finally asked. "Not the HOA as an entity," I said. "But members of its board, yes. And I can prove it?" His tone hardened. "Then we'll make sure this doesn't get buried." That was the moment the tide turned. Within 48 hours, federal investigators were reviewing the case, and subpoenas began to go out. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Bank records revealed that the HOA president had recently approved several maintenance expenses that didn't match any legitimate project. Surveillance footage from nearby properties placed his car near my home the night of the fire. One of the junior board members, scared of what was coming, agreed to cooperate with the authorities. He admitted that the HOA leadership had been meeting privately to send a message to non-members who refused to comply. I listened to his recorded statement with a grim sense of satisfaction. They had built their power on intimidation, never imagining that their victim would be someone who could turn the entire justice system against them. When I was called to give my official statement, I arrived at the precinct dressed in a dark suit, the same kind I wore to court. The officers stood a little straighter when they realized who I was. Most of them had seen my name on federal rulings. One detective, an older man with tired eyes, shook his head as I signed the paperwork. "Can't believe this happened to you, Judge," he said quietly. "People like that think they're untouchable." I looked at him and replied, "Everyone thinks they're untouchable until the law touches them." News of the investigation spread faster than I expected. Local media picked it up first, reporting the fire as a suspicious incident involving HOA disputes. Then regional outlets began running the story, highlighting the irony of an HOA targeting a federal judge. By the end of the week, my name was everywhere, not because I was a victim, but because I was now leading the push for justice. Reporters waited outside the courthouse hoping for a statement, but I gave them none. I preferred silence. I wanted the evidence to speak first. Behind closed doors, the investigation unraveled the true extent of the HOA's corruption. They weren't just enforcing neighborhood rules, they were using membership fees to line their own pockets, running side deals with contractors, and pressuring homeowners through threats and vandalism. Several residents came forward, emboldened by what had happened to me. One woman admitted her tires had been slashed after she questioned a late fee. Another man confessed that he joined the HOA out of fear after they posted for sale signs on his property without consent. Every story added weight to the case. 2 weeks after the fire, the arrests began. The HOA president and 2 senior board members were taken into custody on charges of arson, conspiracy, and extortion. The others faced lesser charges for intimidation and fraud. I was present when the warrants were executed, not as a judge, but as the homeowner whose life they had tried to destroy. Watching them being led away in handcuffs, their once confident faces now pale and shaken, I felt no joy, only finality. Justice had a strange way of balancing itself. Still, even with the arrests, the damage lingered. My house was gone, and with it, years of memories. Insurance covered the rebuild, but money couldn't replace what had been lost. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I'd still smell the phantom trace of smoke, still hear the crackle of fire in my dreams. Yet even in those moments, I felt no regret. If anything, the ordeal had reminded me why I'd devoted my life to the law in the first place. People like the HOA board thrived because others were too afraid to stand up to them. They counted on fear to keep their power. But I had faced far worse than their threats, and they had chosen the wrong man to intimidate. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench near the courthouse waiting for the final investigative report, the same detective who had spoken to me earlier walked over. "Word is, the case will be federalized," he said. "Given your position, it's better handled outside the county. They'll make examples out of these people." I nodded, grateful but resolute. "They want to be the last," I replied. "This kind of abuse runs deeper than one neighborhood." Later that evening, I returned to the site of my burned home. The cleanup crews had cleared most of the debris, leaving behind a flat expanse of dirt and soot. I stood in the middle of it, listening to the wind rustle through the nearby trees. The HOA had tried to erase me from the neighborhood, but instead, they had exposed themselves. Their empire of intimidation was gone, reduced to ashes just like my house. I closed my eyes and imagined the new foundation being laid, the symbol of a fresh start, not just for me, but for everyone they had wronged. In that moment, I felt something shift. The fire had taken everything material, but it had also burned away my patience for corruption, for petty tyrants hiding behind rules. They wanted me to be silent, to submit. Instead, I had dragged their entire world into the light. That was the true punishment, not the prison sentences or the fines, but the humiliation of being seen for what they were. As the last light faded from the sky, I took one final look at the empty lot and whispered to myself, "They tried to destroy a judge. All they did was create justice with fire." Months had passed since the arrests, but the echoes of that night still lingered in my mind. The image of my home engulfed in flames was burned into my memory as vividly as the smoke that had once filled my lungs. Yet, standing before the newly laid foundation of what would soon be my rebuilt house, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Justice had been served. The HOA's leaders, once so arrogant and untouchable, were now awaiting sentencing in federal court. Their empire of intimidation had collapsed overnight, and the neighborhood they ruled through fear was finally free. For the first time in years, people could breathe without looking over their shoulders. But even as things began to settle, I knew the fight wasn't over. The case had grown far beyond one HOA's corruption. It had exposed a network of similar organizations operating under the same deceitful tactics. It was bigger than any of us realized. The investigation had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit found that the HOA's management company had ties to multiple neighborhoods across the state. They were siphoning money from residents through fabricated fees and maintenance charges, funneling it into offshore accounts. What started as a case of arson and intimidation now looked like a statewide criminal conspiracy. I was no longer just the victim of a fire, I had become the key witness in something much larger. When federal prosecutors approached me to assist in reviewing the evidence, I agreed without hesitation. My judicial experience gave me the perspective they needed, and frankly, I wanted to see this through to the end. The more I read, the angrier I became. Ordinary families had been bullied into submission, threatened with foreclosure, and fined into bankruptcy. The same people who had smiled at block parties and pretended to be community leaders had been running an extortion racket in broad daylight. I couldn't help but think back to the first time that HOA president had stood on my porch, talking about community standards. He wasn't protecting anyone. He was building a kingdom, and when I refused to kneel, he burned it down. But his arrogance was his undoing. He didn't just pick the wrong man, he picked the wrong kind of man. As the trial approached, I prepared myself for what I knew would be a long and public battle. The defense tried to argue that there was no direct evidence linking the board to the fire, claiming the arsonist was an unknown individual acting alone. But the cooperating witness, that terrified junior board member, was the prosecution's ace. His testimony detailed every conversation, every meeting where the idea of sending a message had been discussed. When he took the stand and broke down in tears, admitting how he'd been too afraid to stop them, the courtroom was silent. I watched from the gallery, expressionless, but inside I felt a cold satisfaction. For once, the system was working exactly as it should. During recess one afternoon, one of the defense attorneys approached me in the hallway. He was young, nervous, and clearly uncomfortable speaking to a federal judge outside the courtroom. "Judge Ellison," he began, "my clients wanted to extend an apology. They've realized the gravity of what they've done." I met his gaze and said evenly, "Tell your clients that remorse is meaningless when it comes after destruction. They didn't stop when they had the chance. Now the law will stop them for good." He nodded, swallowing hard, and walked away. I didn't hate the men who had burned my home. Hatred would have given them too much power. I only wanted them held accountable to understand that power wielded without conscience always collapses on itself. When the verdicts were finally read weeks later, the courtroom was packed. The HOA president and his two closest allies were found guilty on all counts: arson, conspiracy, extortion, and fraud. The sentences were severe, decades behind bars for each of them. The judge presiding over the case, a colleague I respected deeply, looked them in the eyes before delivering his final words. "You used authority as a weapon," he said. "You took what was meant to protect a community and turned it into something poisonous. Justice demands that you face the consequences." I could see the president's composure break as the gavel struck. It wasn't the fire that destroyed him, it was the truth. After the sentencing, I was approached by several residents from the neighborhood. They thanked me for not backing down, for exposing what everyone else had been too afraid to challenge. Some of them admitted they had suspected corruption for years but didn't know how to fight it. One older man clasped my hand tightly and said, "You didn't just get justice for yourself, Judge. You got it for all of us." His words stayed with me. The fire that had once symbolized loss now represented something else: rebirth. When the state launched its official inquiry into HOA practices, I was invited to speak before the legislature. I explained how unchecked authority in small community organizations could spiral into abuse when no oversight existed. I recommended reforms: mandatory transparency in financial reporting, independent audits, and strict limits on enforcement powers. Lawmakers listened. For once, people paid attention to the silent suffering of homeowners who'd been bullied under the guise of community order. Within months, several new regulations were passed, reshaping how HOAs operated statewide. It was the kind of systemic change that reminded me why I'd entered public service in the first place. Still, even with justice done and laws changed, I couldn't ignore what the ordeal had cost me. My home was gone, and rebuilding took months of planning and patience. I oversaw every detail of the reconstruction personally, not because I wanted perfection, but because I wanted control over what had been stolen from me. When the new house was finally finished, I stood on the porch as dusk settled over the neighborhood. The air was calm, the sky streaked with orange and gold. The neighbors waved, not out of obligation, but out of genuine kindness. The atmosphere had shifted. The fear that once clung to every conversation was gone. The community, once divided by threats and manipulation, had come together through shared resilience. One evening, as I sat in my study overlooking the lake, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Power is a strange thing. In the wrong hands, it corrupts quietly, feeding on pride and fear. In the right hands, it heals. The HOA's downfall wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoring balance, reminding people that no one, no matter how small their domain, has the right to control others through fear. I thought of my late wife and how she used to tell me that justice wasn't about revenge, but about setting things right. For the first time since the fire, I truly understood what she meant. The HOA had burned my house to the ground thinking they could erase me, but all they did was expose themselves to the fire of truth. That fire spread further than they ever imagined into the courts, the legislature, and the hearts of people who had been silent too long. It burned away corruption, arrogance, and fear, leaving behind something pure, accountability. As I turned off the light and stepped outside to the cool night air, I looked up at the stars and smiled faintly. They thought they could destroy a judge. But all they did was teach him, once again, that justice doesn't burn, it endures.